The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Theological Noncognitivism and Ignosticism. What the hell did he just say? That's the reaction that I'm kind of expecting from quite a number of people. I want to tell you how this came about. I've said before that having one-on-one private conversations isn't particularly useful to me. It's not always a waste of my time, but sometimes it seems that, and I'd much rather have the conversations with an audience. There's a reason why I am more willing to have public debates, why I produce videos like this, and why I do a call-in TV show, rather than just walking around like some of the street preachers trying to have a whole bunch of individual conversations. This way, I think there's a lot more value. Somebody contacted me the other day and asked me, hey, what are your thoughts on theological noncognitivism? And I gave my thoughts, why I reject theological noncognitivism. We had a back and forth conversation that wasn't very productive because he had what seems to me to be a rather esoteric usage of the label. It doesn't seem to fit with how I understood it. There was also some concern about taking things personally, some misunderstandings, and eventually I was just told that I was a dick, which may be the case. But rather than have that conversation be truly wasted time, I thought that I would do a video for the Atheist Debates Project on theological noncognitivism, what my thoughts were. And I want to point out at the beginning, this is not an incredibly popular argument or position. I'm not pretending to be an expert on it, and I'm not pretending in any way that I have reviewed the subject and the main proponents of this idea sufficiently to offer this as a rebuttal. Instead, these are my thoughts. If people, want to make the case for theological noncognitivism and agnosticism, after, having heard this, I'm open to having my mind changed. But what the heck is theological noncognitivism to begin with? So theological noncognitivism, as I understand it, is essentially the claim that theological language, labels, ideas like God, have no cognitive meaning because they aren't well defined. Those advocating for theological noncognitivism will essentially use gibberish, a string of letters that has no cognitive content, that conveys no meaning, to bolster their point. And out of this kind of more formal philosophical label came another label called Ignosticism, which essentially branches off perhaps a little from theological noncognitivism to say that God is so ill-defined that it's a waste of time to even discuss it, that there's not enough cognitive meaning there for anyone to make up their mind or to have an actual position. So I'm not an atheist, I'm not an agnostic, I'm not a theist, I'm an ignostic. And now I'm done with the conversation. I don't buy it. I don't buy it for a second. And every time it's been presented to me, I viewed it as a bit of a dishonest treatment of the subject, and I thought that I would explain why. But I know that some of you out there are saying, but Matt, we've heard you talk about the supernatural. We've heard you rail against the label supernatural for years. As a matter of fact, you've even got a video as part of your Atheist Debates project about how it's not well defined. It's something that, could mean anything to anybody, that it becomes a useless term. How is that not the same as what people are saying with regard to theological noncognitivism? And I'm probably just going to say agnosticism from now on and link them together in the video, because theological noncognitivism is a mouthful. It's different from my position on supernatural in subtle ways. And by the way, my position on the supernatural also applies to God. The God label is used in many, many different ways. The fundamental positions coming out of theology, the doctrines, they are so confusing and so ill-defined that I think this is the reason why there's over 1,000 denominations that identify as Christian. But that doesn't mean that they're gibberish. It doesn't mean that they are without any sort of cognitive value, that they don't convey any meaning. In the conversation that I had with the gentleman who doesn't like me, and perhaps for good reason, I tried very hard to stick with, simple, common usages for theological noncognitivism. If you go to Wikipedia and look it up, there's like a paragraph or two. You can find Massimo Pigliucci and some others perhaps talking about this particular subject. I know that a number of them identify as non-cognitivists. I don't, and I can't. And the reason I can't is because they've defined it in such a way that it goes a bit too far. I am constantly cautioning my fellow atheists on not going too far, not overreaching. Instead of just, you could say, hey, we don't have any good reason, or we don't yet have sufficient reason to think that the Jesus in the Bible was a historical figure. Instead of that being the stopping point, they want to go further and say, Jesus never existed. Instead of saying, we don't have good reason to believe that a God exists, instead they will say, we're absolutely sure that God doesn't exist, or we know that God doesn't exist. And there's little problems in language. People are confused over what the term atheist means. We don't have complete agreement over what the words belief and knowledge mean. We should. These are fairly straightforward. But the fact that we're not completely in agreement about how these terms should be used doesn't make any of them cognitively meaningless. It doesn't make any of them gibberish. One of the common kind of tactics that the theological noncogs actually do is to say, the God label is without any cognitive meaning. It's not well defined, and it's defined in so many different ways that, you really have no idea what anybody is conveying. Well, it's true that if someone just says to you, I believe in God, you have to prompt for more information before you have a good understanding of what it is that they're saying. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't convey any meaning. The tactic that they use is to say, for example, if I put up a string of letters, ZXYPR, well, that carries no cognitive meaning at all. It's gibberish. You're correct. I agree. ZXYPR, as far as I can tell, has no usage or meaning. It is devoid of any productive content. However you want to label it, that's definitely what I would consider gibberish. But why did you have to use that clearly meaningless string of letters as an analogy to a different set of letters, a different set of phonemes, a different label for a concept? If they were truly both meaningless, you wouldn't have to pull up another one. Like, for example, ZXYQR, I could say BCFGRL. BCFGRL, that is an example of something that is cognitively meaningless, and that's why I think that XPQRW is also cognitively meaningless. Okay, I'm in agreement with you on both of those. I'm not in agreement with you on this other one. So you have to dig into kind of what the label means. And the dishonest portion or inaccurate portion of the argument from non-cogs is that the fact that something is ill-defined means that it's meaningless. And I think that that's fundamentally flawed. The fact that they had to come up with a gibberish word to use as an analogy for a word that's not gibberish was already a demonstration of the problem with their position. But there are more problems, and I'll get to those in just a little bit. But first I wanted to talk about the individual that I spoke to had a completely different view, or a significantly different view, of theological noncognitivism, and on the off chance that his is shared by other people, I want to actually address that as fairly as possible too. And this part's going to be a little bit difficult because he was all over the place, and I'm not completely sure that I'm going to fairly represent it, but I think I can get to the nuts and bolts of a couple of the things that he said. And if somebody out there shares those, maybe they can clarify as to why he's right and I'm wrong or whatever. But he begins with this idea that the concept must have a real world referent, that it is cognitively meaningless or qualifies under the theological noncognitivism label if the concept presented does not have a real world referent. And so one of the examples he used is if somebody says that God is the supreme being. Well, that doesn't have a real world referent. Okay, it actually kind of does. We know what beings are. We are beings. We've talked about this. We also have a usage of the word supreme. That would mean the greatest. And so we've communicated, when we say God is the supreme being, we've communicated a concept of God. We are defining in this limited capacity as a thinking agent who is the best. Now, under classical theism, you would have the omni-God, that is all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, etc., boom, boom, boom. But you don't need all of that. Merely saying that there's a supreme being, we may not have a complete understanding of what it means to be a supreme being or what all aspects are contained within a supreme being. But it's not gibberish. If you said God is Fergoburgle, okay, that's told me nothing. But that's fundamentally different from God is a supreme being. We can ask further questions and we can try to get clarity, and we can try to see whether or not the concept is sufficiently well defined for us to accept it. But that's fundamentally different from whether or not the concept is sufficiently well defined for us to grasp what the other person is talking about. And if you want to say that something doesn't carry cognitive meaning, if you want to say that it's gibberish, that has to be the focus of the conversation. Whether or not there's a real world referent is far closer to issues of epistemology, of reality, of, oh, you've mentioned something, but does it exist in reality? The phrase invisible pink unicorn. We know what invisible means, we know what pink means, we know what unicorn means, or at least we have some concept of these. These aren't cognitively meaningless. That doesn't mean that the fact that we have no reason to think that an invisible pink unicorn exists or could exist in reality, that doesn't make the phrase cognitively meaningless. One of the examples that we came up with is he mentioned, I'd mentioned dragons and whatever else. He mentioned that Harry Potter may not be well defined, well understood, but it's a fictional character, whereas God is presented as a non-fictional character. And for the life of me, no matter how much I tried, and it probably seemed like a waste of time to many of you watching this, I was trying to figure out how something becomes cognitively meaningful when we stop saying it exists in reality and define it as fictional. For example, if God and Harry Potter neither were particularly well defined, and they both were portrayed as being real, this individual was saying, there's no real world referent for it, therefore they're cognitively meaningless. Well, I could maybe see epistemologically meaningless, or maybe see realistically meaningless, but the fact that Harry Potter becomes fiction doesn't make it cognitively meaningful. And we haven't, this is also a mild cheat on his part, because I think God is fictional. Oh, well, the believers don't think God's fictional. That's irrelevant. I think that God is fictional. It doesn't become cognitively meaningful or meaningless depending on whether or not one of those characteristics exists in reality. Having that characteristic may give you a better understanding, but it doesn't mean that it's meaningless. This gets back to what I was saying earlier on, that the fact that a phrase for a concept is not fully defined, the fact that it may be used in different ways, does not mean that it's meaningless. Now, I'm sure that there are people out there who are advocating for theological noncognitivism, who are advocating for ignosticism, who are like, oh, no, we're not saying that it's actually wholly meaningless, just not that it's sufficiently meaningful in order for us to have a position on it. I get that. I understand that. And that's the next thing I'll address. This is what I was referencing when I talked about people saying, but Matt, you've talked about the supernatural and how it's so ill-defined that it's almost functionally meaningless or seemingly meaningless, that you don't understand what it means. That's correct, but I wouldn't label it cognitively meaningless. It's very clear to me that when people use the word supernatural, they are attempting to convey some meaning. They may not always be successful. They may not actually grasp the concept. As a matter of fact, they may not even have a concept in their mind that truly maps to the label, but they've heard the label and in a fuzzy way it seems to kind of fit with what they're talking about, so they're going to use that label anyway. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other people who don't have a strong understanding of the concept that they're trying to convey, or the concept that they're labeling as supernatural or God or salvation or whatever theological concept comes into this. To pretend that something is theological or that is cognitively meaningless just because it's not properly defined, there's a slippery slope there, because we argue over what knowledge is and whether it exists. Is that a concept that's also lacking cognitive meaning because we don't have a fully well understood, commonly shared among everybody concept of knowledge? It's this rendering of ill-defined concepts as if they are equivalent to gibberish that I have a problem with. Now, it's possible that you can find a clip of me talking about the supernatural and saying that it's essentially gibberish. If that's the case, I'll retract that and list it as a hyperbole, because that's not quite what I'm trying to represent. If ever there was a rebuttal for the idea that God concepts are cognitively meaningless, I think it's this. For the entirety of human history, or for the most of human history, people have believed in gods and believed in the supernatural. There are billions of believers on the planet right now. They didn't all start off as believers. As a matter of fact, I'd argue that none of them started off as believers, which means that there were individuals who had a concept and were able to communicate that concept and share it with people and convince those people. And those people have gone on to convince other people and have meetings and gatherings to discuss this. And yes, God is incredibly poorly defined, and it is defined in many different ways by many different religions, and perhaps even each adherent has their own distinct view of God. But there's some minimal set of characteristics that they probably share, or at least share in groupings. And so maybe it's not particularly valuable to talk about God without also defining which God or which category of God we're talking about. And yet still, we're categorizing God, which means there's something within that concept that we can grasp, think about, discuss, and categorize. It's frustrating that there's not a real world referent for God, so that we can come to an understandable consensus on what that concept is in fact pointing to. But one of the other things that happened during this conversation is that I used the word pretends. And he took offense at that, thinking I was accusing him of pretending, when in actuality what I had said was theological noncognitivism, the position, pretends that something that is unclear is equivalent to something that is gibberish. And in much the same way that it's like saying a smoked glass is the same as a dense wall. That's just not true. It's unclear. It's not as good as a clear piece of glass. And in response to that, he tried to argue that if I use the word pretend, I must be talking about something a person does. He couldn't take a metaphoric, anthropomorphic view of this. And so he popped up the dictionary definition of pretend. And then he popped up another dictionary definition. And unknowingly, he had defeated his own position in my mind and given me what I think is another sound rebuttal to this idea of theological noncognitivism. And that is XYPQWR BFW963, those don't have entries in the dictionary. But the theological language that you're wanting to label as equivalent to that gibberish does have entries in the dictionary. Now, dictionaries aren't authorities. They're not prescriptive. They don't define words. They describe how those words are used. They are descriptive, and they're useful tools. And I get frustrated when somebody tries to come to the dictionary as if it's an authority that confirms their view. The only time that's useful is when you say, here is a common usage of this word, and then you show that it actually exists in the dictionary as a common usage of that word. But if you look at a dictionary, whether you look at it as an authority or whether it's descriptive, it's pretty clear that there's an entry for God in most English dictionaries. And the same would be true in other languages as well. Perhaps not every language. There's an entry for salvation. There's an entry for supernatural. Clearly, they're not equivalent to gibberish. They may be relatively useless. They may be incredibly unclear. They may be poorly defined. They may be defined in many, many different ways, such that you have to ask clarifying questions. I agree with all of that. I have no use for the term supernatural. I have no use for the term spiritual. I only have use for the term God once I get a further clarification in order to have a discussion with people about how they intend this phrase to be used. The dictionary entries don't exist for the gibberish. And so while theological noncognitivism and Ignosticism may be onto something, I think that they're both overreaching. And in the case of Ignosticism, there are a bunch of atheists who don't want to identify with the atheist label, and they think they found a clever way of avoiding the question. I don't think it's particularly clever, and I don't know that it avoids the question. But for those people who understand at least what I'm talking about with respect to theological noncognitivism and agnosticism, I think it should be clear that if somebody says, hey, do you believe in God? And you say, I'm an agnostic, that you are responding in the wrong way. Because if somebody says, hey, do you believe in God? You should answer yes, no, or what do you mean by God? And when they give you their usage for the God label, it's of no use to say at that point that you're agnostic. You either accept that or not. And if it's still unclear, you get to ask clarifying questions. But the fact that it's used in different ways doesn't make it gibberish. And that's my at least somewhat initial, somewhat midstream thoughts about theological noncognitivism and agnosticism. Your mileage may vary. And if I've gotten something wrong, as always, you feel free to contact me, make your case for it, because it's not a topic that has been covered in great detail. It's one that I wasn't going to cover at all if it hadn't been for the fact that someone asked me to, and then went off in a strange direction with what seems to be their own version of this. That's it for this time, and this will close out actually September's videos. I'm on my way to London for an event with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris when I get back. I might be doing some more debate reviews, but I know that there's at least one topic that we've heard about many, many times, which hasn't made it to the Atheist Debates Project, and we'll hit that one in October. Oh, no, I'm not going to tell you what it is. Maybe it's gibberish.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.